America can't be like this. Hungarian POWs realized everything they were told was wrong about America. The trucks rolled through morning mist like ghosts made of metal and exhaust. April 1945. Somewhere between the chaos of surrender and an unknown fate, 30 Hungarian women huddled in the back of American military transport, their world reduced to the rattle of chains and the smell of fear mixed with diesel. When the fog finally lifted, the first shapes emerged: whitewashed fences, laundry lines stretching between wooden posts, and then, impossibly, the scent that made every woman's head turn coffee. Real coffee. And something sweet beneath it, cinnamon maybe, or fresh bread. Julianna Kovács, 26 years old, mother of a child she hadn't seen in 8 months, former clerk turned auxiliary soldier, pressed her face against the cold metal rail of the truck bed. Her knuckles went white. Behind her, women whispered in Hungarian, their voices tight with terror. This cannot be America. But the camp spreading before them looked nothing like the horror they'd been promised. No cages, no dogs straining at leashes, no blood-stained dirt or guards with whips, just neat rows of barracks, a small infirmary with a red cross painted cleanly on the roof, and American soldiers standing at parade rest, faces neutral, almost bored. Before we go deeper into this story that changed everything these women believed about enemies and about themselves, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Tell me, when was the last time kindness made you question everything you thought you knew about someone? Because for Julianna and the others, that moment was about to shatter their world. They'd been told stories during the transport from the Eastern Front: rape, beatings, humiliation. Some said American camps were just torture sites with paperwork, that women prisoners would be used, broken, discarded. Julianna had prepared herself for violence the way you prepare for drowning, by taking one last breath and accepting the inevitable. The truck lurched to a stop. Guards shouted orders in English and the women flinched, bracing for blows. But the hands that helped them down from the truck were firm, not cruel steady, not violent. Then Julianna saw them. Red Cross nurses stepping forward with metal trays balanced on both hands. Steam rose from cups arranged in neat rows, and beside each cup, impossibly, sat a cinnamon roll, golden brown and glistening with sugar. A woman behind Julianna whispered, "It's a trick. They want us calm before they start." But when Sergeant Raymond Carter appeared, mid-30s with tired eyes and a voice that carried authority without cruelty, he spoke through an interpreter first, then, in careful, deliberate Hungarian, "You will be treated under the Geneva Convention. You are prisoners of war, not animals." Julianna stared at the cinnamon roll a nurse held out to her, and one thought burned through everything else. If America is like this, what does that make us? They stood in rows while American clerks recorded their names with careful precision. Julianna noticed everything. The way the guards never raised their voices unnecessarily. How a Red Cross nurse gently guided a pregnant woman to sit down without being asked. The clipboard that said their names in English letters, spelled phonetically but respectfully. Sergeant Carter moved through the lines like a man who hated every order he had to give. When he reached the pregnant woman, he knelt slightly. "How far along?" he asked through the interpreter. The woman, terrified, whispered, 6 months. Carter nodded and made a note. "She gets extra rations. No heavy work. The coffee was real." Julianna held the metal cup in both hands, feeling warmth spread through her palms. The cinnamon roll dissolved on her tongue like a childhood memory she'd thought was lost forever. Around her, women ate in silence, some crying, some staring at the food like it might vanish if they looked away. An interpreter, a Hungarian-American woman named Margaret, explained the camp rules in their native language. Her accent was American, but her Hungarian was fluent, native. "You'll sleep in barracks. 6 to a room. There are showers with hot water. You'll receive clean uniforms. If you're sick or injured, you'll see a doctor." One woman, Kata, barely 19, asked the question they were all thinking. Why? Why treat us like this? Margaret's eyes softened. Because you're human beings. That's reason enough. That night, in the barracks lit by single bulbs hanging from wooden beams, Julianna found a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper. She wrote by the dim light, her handwriting shaky. They gave us coffee and bread. They speak our language. They have not hit us, not once. This cannot be America. If this kindness is real, what have we become? She folded the paper and tucked it under her thin mattress, not knowing why she was keeping a record, only knowing that someday someone might need to know that this impossible thing had happened. The barracks settled into an uneasy rhythm. 6 women to a room, each carrying different burdens, different beliefs about what was happening to them. Julianna learned their names quickly. Elizabeth, a former nurse with steady hands and skeptical eyes who'd seen too much to believe anything quickly. Ilona, sharp-faced and rigid, who'd been a true believer in the Reich's propaganda and wasn't ready to let it go. Carter, young and desperate to trust the kindness she was seeing, and others, each with their own story of how they'd ended up here. At night, they talked in whispers, about Budapest before the war, about streets lined with cafes and the Danube glittering under summer sun, about how they'd been recruited, promised, pressured into auxiliary service, clerks, nurses, communications operators, and how, when capture came, they'd expected to be labeled the worst things men could call women who served in war. But the Americans hadn't called them anything. They'd simply processed them, housed them, fed them. It's psychological warfare, Ilona insisted one night, her voice sharp. They soften us with kindness, make us compliant, then use us for propaganda, or worse, don't be fools. Carter, sitting cross-legged on her bunk, shook her head. If they wanted to hurt us, why wait? Why speak to us in Hungarian? Why give medicine to the sick ones? Elizabeth, always the pragmatist, said quietly, maybe they're exactly what they claim to be, people following rules. Julianna stayed silent, but she watched. She watched Carter check on a feverish woman in the middle of the night, instructing a nurse to bring extra broth. She watched American soldiers queue for meals, just like the prisoners, no special treatment, no swagger. She watched guards laugh with each other, homesick boys in uniform, not monsters. That night she wrote again, we cannot all be right. Someone is lying. The question is who? Our own leaders who promised us the Americans were savages, or our own eyes that see breakfast and clean beds and rules enforced without brutality? She didn't have an answer, but the question itself was dangerous enough to change everything. The incident happened on a Tuesday morning during kitchen detail. Julianna was washing dishes alongside 5 other women when Ilona, assigned to carry potato sacks, suddenly snapped. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the psychological weight of being treated with dignity when she'd been trained to expect degradation. Whatever the reason, she threw a metal pot across the kitchen and screamed at a guard in German-accented English, "Just do it! Just hit me and stop pretending!" Every woman in that kitchen froze. This was it. The moment the mask would come off, the moment they'd see the real America, the one they'd been warned about. Guards reacted immediately. 3 moved in, fast but controlled. Ilona was restrained, arms pulled behind her back, but not twisted. She was shouted at, sharp commands to calm down, but not beaten, not thrown to the ground, not struck. Carter arrived within minutes, his face hard with barely controlled anger. Julianna waited for violence. Instead, Carter spoke in clipped Hungarian, 24 hours isolation. No one is beaten in this camp, ever, but you will follow the rules. Ilona was led away, still defiant but unharmed. The kitchen remained silent for long minutes after. Finally, Carter whispered, "That's it? That's the punishment?" Elizabeth's face was unreadable. If they wanted to break us, they just wasted their best chance. That evening, Julianna overheard Carter talking to Margaret outside the barracks. His voice carried through the thin walls. I hate this job. I hate having to guard people who look at me like I'm going to hurt them. But we walk the line, right? Rules, not revenge." Margaret replied softly, "They'll remember how you treated them long after the uniforms come off." When Ilona returned the next day, she looked exhausted but not broken. No bruises, no burns, no scars, just tired and perhaps, for the first time, uncertain. Julianna wrote in her hidden diary that night, "They had every excuse to hurt her, every reason. She provoked them, and they didn't. What kind of enemy shows mercy to those who challenge them?" Work became routine, kitchen detail, laundry, garden work. The Hungarian women moved through the camp learning its rhythms, and in doing so, learning something more dangerous about their captors. They were ordinary people. In the kitchen, Julianna worked beside American soldiers who queued politely for meals, who said "thank you" when handed plates, who joked about missing their mother's cooking. She watched guards play cards during breaks, share photographs of sweethearts back home, complain about the Texas heat in the same way she'd complain about Budapest summers. Margaret, the Hungarian-American nurse, began teaching English phrases in exchange for Hungarian idioms. "How do you say good morning in your dialect?" she'd ask, genuinely curious. The women found themselves teaching her words from their childhoods, words that had nothing to do with war. One guard, a young corporal from Ohio, shared that he'd lost a brother in the European theater. Julianna expected hatred in his eyes. Instead, she saw grief. "I don't know which side got him," he admitted quietly. "German, Hungarian, doesn't matter anymore. He's gone either way." But knowledge brought guilt. News filtered through censored letters, Red Cross bulletins, whispered rumors, atrocities on the Eastern Front labor camps, deportations, things the women had seen shadows of but never fully acknowledged. Some refused to believe it. Others, like Erzsébet, became withdrawn, remembering trains they'd seen, orders they hadn't questioned, disappearances they'd learned not to notice. The breaking point came in the barracks one night. Ilona, still bitter about her isolation, accused the others of betraying their country by accepting American kindness. "You're forgetting who you are." Julianna, quiet for weeks, finally spoke. "Maybe we're remembering who we are for the first time. Maybe we were the ones who forgot what it meant to be human." The words hung in the air like smoke. That night she wrote, "If they can show mercy to enemies, then our hatred was built on lies. And if their kindness is real, what does that make those who taught us to hate?" The discovery happened during a routine inspection. Carter found Julianna's diary tucked under her mattress. He didn't read it immediately, couldn't read Hungarian anyway, but he recognized what it was. Names, dates, sketches of the camp, pages of careful handwriting. He brought it to Margaret. "Can you translate this? I need to know if it's a security concern." Margaret read it that evening, slowly, carefully, and when she finished, she brought it back to Carter with tears in her eyes. "You need to read this, all of it." Through Margaret's translation, Carter read Julianna's words. "America cannot be like this. If this kindness is real, it changes everything." And later, "The worst part isn't discovering the enemy isn't a monster, it's realizing you might have served one." 2 days later, Carter called Julianna into a small office. She entered terrified, certain she was about to be punished for keeping unauthorized records. Instead, Carter spoke gently through Margaret. "You wrote that if our kindness is real, it changes everything. Do you still believe that?" Julianna's composure shattered. Words poured out in Hungarian, translated by Margaret, about what they'd been told, about rape camps and torture and humiliation awaiting any woman captured by Americans, about how every act of mercy had cracked something inside her, something she'd built to survive. Carter listened without interrupting. When she finished, he spoke about his own story, about growing up hearing that Germans and their allies were monsters, about losing friends in combat, about the hatred he'd carried until he had to look into the eyes of prisoners and see exhausted, scared people instead of the enemies he'd been taught to hate. "We were both raised in cages," he said quietly. "Different cages, but cages made of the same fear and lies." Julianna walked back to her barracks that afternoon with her diary returned to her. On the first page, Margaret had written in Hungarian, "These words matter. Keep writing." For the first time since capture, Julianna felt something like hope. The news came in fragments, first whispers, then Red Cross bulletins, then undeniable reality. The war was ending. The Reich was collapsing. Budapest had fallen to Soviet forces. And with the news came stories. Labor camps, mass graves, atrocities documented with photographs and testimonies that couldn't be denied even by the most committed believers. The camp grew quiet in a different way, not the quiet of fear, but the quiet of reckoning. Ilona stopped eating for 2 days. When Julianna found her crying behind the barracks, she was repeating the same words. "We wore the wrong uniform. We served the wrong side." The Americans didn't gloat. If anything, they became more subdued. Guards listened to radio broadcasts with grim faces. One told Margaret, "There are no winners in this, just different kinds of losing." The women gathered in their barracks at night, no longer arguing about whether the Americans were deceiving them. That question had been answered. Now they faced harder ones. What had they been part of? What had their service enabled, even indirectly? How could they return to a homeland that might not exist anymore, to families that might not have survived? Julianna wrote in her diary with a hand that shook. "The worst part isn't discovering the enemy isn't a monster. It's realizing that we might have been the monsters all along. Not individually, not intentionally, but by serving, by not questioning, by believing the lies we were told, because believing was easier than seeing." Erzsébet read it over her shoulder and added her own thought. Maybe that's what they wanted us to learn. Not that Americans are good, but that anyone can become what we became if they stop asking questions. May 8th, 1945. The American flag at the camp flew at full mast. Carter gathered the prisoners in the yard and announced the official end of hostilities in Europe. "You will be processed for repatriation," he said in Hungarian. "You can return home, or you can apply for displaced person status under United Nations programs. The choice is yours." The reactions split immediately. Some women wept with joy, desperate to find their families. Others stood frozen, terrified of returning to Soviet-occupied Hungary, to accusations of collaboration, to a country that might treat them as traitors. Julianna thought of her daughter, now 9 years old if she'd survived, but she also thought of the Hungary she'd left versus the one she'd returned to. 2 days before the first transport, Carter found Julianna in the garden. "What will you do?" he asked. "I don't know yet. Home isn't a place anymore. It's just a question mark." He nodded slowly. "Margaret said you might want to stay. Work as a civilian employee with Red Cross operations. Help with other displaced persons." Julianna looked at the neat rows of barracks, at the camp that had shattered everything she believed. "Is it wrong that I feel safer here than I would at home?" "No," Carter said simply. "It's not wrong. It's just honest." In the end, Julianna chose to stay, at least for now, not because America was perfect, but because it had shown her that enemies could become complicated, that mercy could exist even in war. 30 years later, an aging Julianna Kovács sat in a small apartment in New York, her diary open on the table before her. She'd eventually returned to Hungary in 1952, found her daughter alive, brought her to America in 1956 during the uprising. She'd spent decades teaching her children not to believe simple stories about good nations and evil ones. "They prepared us for cages and chains," she wrote in the final entry of that old diary. "Instead, America gave us breakfast and forced us to look in the mirror that was harder than any punishment they could have devised." The diary is now preserved in the National Archives. One woman's testimony to the complexity of war and the dangerous power of mercy. If this story reminded you that history is about people trying to stay human in impossible times, hit subscribe. Tell me in the comments about moments when kindness changed what you believed, because somewhere right now, someone is living their own version of this question: who are the real monsters?